1868, Union Pacific crews were laying track in western Wyoming. They were making good progress due to the relatively flat terrain, but things were about to change. Ahead loomed the Wasatch Grade. The railroad needed to traverse a change in altitude of 2,501 feet in 65 miles. After surveying potential routes, the railroad settled on a grade that followed Echo Canyon to its confluence with Weber Canyon and then followed Weber to the Salt Lake Plains. The route's grade was fairly even and the canyons were relatively wide. Today there's room for a double-tracked railroad, the 2-lane Lincoln Highway, and a 4-lane interstate. Crews had started working on the grade in the fall of 1868, ahead of the track layers. Living conditions for the grading crews were primitive. At first, supplies were carried by wagon, using an existing road. The grading crews used cuts and fills to achieve the required grade. Work was done with hand tools and horses, supplemented with explosives when needed. When a cut was finished, track was laid and supplies were carried forward by rail. About 5 miles down Echo Canyon, the route required a tunnel, called Tunnel Number 2, which was 787 feet long. The entire length of the tunnel required timber reinforcement. The timber lining was replaced with concrete in the 1920s. While Tunnel Number 2 was being completed, the track-laying crews leapfrogged ahead and continued laying track. On January 15th of 1869, tracks had reached Echo City at the confluence of Echo and Weber Canyon. In the spring of 1869, Tunnel Number 2 was completed and track was laid, allowing supplies to be carried forward by rail. The next obstacle was located further down Weber Canyon at Devil's Gate. At this point, there were sheer rock walls on both sides of the river. The Union Pacific removed some rock and constructed a temporary track to carry supplies down the canyon, but the track's curve was too severe for the final alignment. So, in September of 1868, work was started on the 508-foot Tunnel Number 3. There was also a Tunnel Number 4 just downstream. In April of 1869, both tunnels were completed. The way was clear to the mouth of Weber Canyon. The completed line had a grade of 1.77%, the most severe on the entire Union Pacific system. When the railroad reached the mouth of Weber Canyon, it turned north and headed to Promontory Summit and the meeting with the Central Pacific on May 10, 1869. By the dawn of the 20th century, with ever-increasing traffic, the Wasatch had become a major bottleneck on the Union Pacific. It was decided that a second track would be needed. Work was completed in 1926. Here, the completed double track clings to the side of Weber Canyon. A second bridge and tunnel was added at Tunnel Number 3 in 1917. The new line was used for eastbound trains and had a grade of 1.14% with a maximum curve of 3 degrees, as compared to the original line's grade of 1.77% with a maximum curve of 6 degrees. This was the grade the big boys were designed to conquer. Initially, the Union Pacific used 440 locomotives. These were the locomotives used to construct the Wasatch Grade. From the start, 2 locomotives were required on many parts of the UP system, but double heading added expense and delay. In the first part of the 20th century, increased traffic meant UP needed a locomotive that could pull the Wasatch Grade unassisted. But at this time, no such locomotive existed. Locomotives started getting bigger, like this 260, but they were no match for the Wasatch Grade. The first locomotive designed to pull the Wasatch Grade unassisted was a group of 210-2s delivered starting in 1917. These locomotives initially could pull the grade unassisted, but as freight trains became longer and heavier, helper engines were required again. Their biggest drawback was that they had a top speed of only 40 miles an hour. The 210-2s worked helper service on the Wasatch Grade till the end of steam in the 1950s. This 482 was capable of higher speeds, but required helpers to get over the Wasatch Grade. With fast freights like the Pacific Fruit Express making up a larger percentage of the Union Pacific's traffic, the Wasatch Grade had become more and more of a bottleneck. To speed up operations, the Union Pacific needed a locomotive that could pull the Wasatch Grade unassisted and at a good speed. In 1936, the Union Pacific decided to try again to combine speed and pulling power. The result was the Challengers. These were a 4664 articulated design, which was basically two locomotives under one boiler. The Challenger design was a success. Ultimately, 105 were built, but it had one drawback. It could not pull typical freight loads over the Wasatch Grade without helpers. In 1940, UP decided to try again. The resulting locomotive was nicknamed Big Boy. The design goal was to pull 3,600 tons up the Wasatch Grade unassisted. In addition, it would need to safely travel at 80 miles per hour. To meet these goals, UP added 4 driver wheels and upped the Challenger's boiler pressure of 275 psi to 300 psi. The Wasatch Grade needed to be upgraded to handle the size and weight of the Big Boys. The Big Boys were the maximum sized locomotive that could operate on the Wasatch Grade. The design was a success. At last, UP had a locomotive that could pull the Wasatch unassisted and still travel at high speed on lesser grades. In the end, steam could not compete with the efficiency of diesel locomotives, and the Big Boys were retired along with all of UP's steam locomotives in 1959. In 1962, 4014 was given to a museum in Pomona, California. In 2012, Union Pacific decided to restore a Big Boy to operating condition. 4014 was selected for restoration and towed back to the Union Pacific Steam Shop in Cheyenne, Wyoming. The locomotive was completely disassembled and parts were renewed or replaced as necessary. Here is a steam pipe. Here are the drivers being turned on a lathe after renewal in Strasburg, Pennsylvania. These are the crossheads responsible for converting the horizontal motion of the piston to the rotary motion of the main rod. Finally, the locomotive was reassembled. The locomotive first went to Ogden, Utah for the anniversary of the Golden Spike ceremony. Shown here is 4014, doubleheading with UP 844 in Weber Canyon. Later that year, 4014 commenced a tour of the UP system. On November 15, 2019, on a beautiful fall day, 4014 visited Russellville, Arkansas. 4014 was running late and a crowd eagerly awaited its arrival. Not surprisingly, there were many older folks who remembered seeing working steam locomotives in their youth, but there were also many young families who brought their children. Then in the distance, a headlight appeared, and 4014 came closer and closer. Luckily, I had chosen a vantage point right in front of where 4014 stopped. The crew immediately started lubricating and inspecting the locomotive. As the crew was finishing lubrication and inspection, I moved to get a closer look. Here are the massive 68-inch drivers and associated side rods and main rod. Advances in metallurgy allowed the rods to be lighter while retaining the needed strength. Decreased mass saves wear and tear on the locomotive and tracks. Here is a close-up of the Walsert's valve gear, a dependable design patented in 1844. This is the eccentric link. A new forging was made and machined. This is the crosshead guide. It too is new. This is the main rod which transfers power from the piston to the drivers. This is an original part that was reconditioned. It has over 1 million miles on it, but is good as new. 4014 uses a simple, foolproof token system to ensure the locomotive doesn't move while someone is working on it. 4014 is 2 locomotives under a single boiler. Here are the front steam chest, cylinder, valve gear, and drivers. Immediately behind is the second steam engine. The lower large pipe conducts steam from the front of the locomotive to the second valve chest. Because the locomotive is articulated right behind the first set of drivers, this pipe must accommodate this motion under 300 psi of steam pressure. This motion is accommodated using brand new bronze bushings. At 1,250,000 pounds, 4014 is a fully operational example of state-of-the-art 1940 steam technology. Thanks to the Union Pacific for investing in 4014's restoration, so people all over the United States can see 4014 steaming down the track for many years to come. The locomotive was serviced and the crew had patiently answered onlookers' questions. It was time to leave Russellville, Arkansas. Engineer Ed Dickens sounded the whistle. Before 4014 can leave, any condensed steam in the cylinders must be cleared. Ed opens the cylinder drain cocks and steam begins to escape, taking with it any condensation. Next, Ed opens the throttle. A puff of steam exits the funnel, and 4014 slowly departs Russellville, heading up the Arkansas River Valley towards western Arkansas and eventually home in Cheyenne, Wyoming. The big boy gradually picks up speed, with engineer Ed Dickens' steady hand on the throttle. Right behind the locomotive is the tender, which used to carry coal and water, but now carries fuel oil. Following the tender are 2 water cars used to make steam. .4014 travels with an auxiliary diesel, which is used to provide dynamic braking and save wear and tear on the locomotive and cars. Next in the consist are cars with a mobile machine shop, a parts car, and a break room for the crew. And finally, some of UP's meticulously maintained fleet of vintage passenger cars. They were originally used on the UP's famous passenger trains like the city of San Francisco. On this trip, they were used to transport VIPs. I wish I was a VIP. Too soon, the last car with his observation deck disappears from view, and 4014's visit is but a memory. As the big boy headed west, Arkansas's lovely fall weather turned to cold and snow. This is 4014 crossing the North Platte River north of LaSalle, Colorado. Here the big boy navigates a grade near Spear in southern Wyoming. Finally, the big boy returned home to Cheyenne, shown here going under the iconic C&S Bridge. If you'd like to see more videos about the history of railroading, hit the like button and leave a comment below.